Hello, noswaith dda. Good evening. My name is Phil Morgan. This evening I shall be talking about silviculture and especially continuous cover forestry and pause restoration that Farming Connect has asked me to do a presentation on. So I hope to be able to pass on some ideas that are useful for managing irregular woodlands. I run my company, Sustainable Forest Management, and I manage a wide variety of forests and woodlands in Wales, including farm woodlands and new planting. Right, so this is an introduction to the silviculture of continuous cover forestry and pause restoration. Silviculture, what is it? Silviculture is in the title of this presentation, so what is it? The keywords and the definitions, the Wikipedia one above there, is controlling, composition, and structure. And also, that's in both the definitions, but it also is meeting values and needs, especially through timber production. Timber production is at the very core of silviculture. Continuous cover forestry. The term continuous cover forestry was first used in the 1990s and was stimulated by the formation of the Continuous Cover Forestry Group in March 1991. Continuous cover forestry is an approach to forest management. It's not a system, it's an approach to forest management and is based on principles. The first is adapting the forest to the site. The second, a holistic management of the forest ecosystem rather than just managing trees. The maintenance of forest conditions is absolutely essential, and this implies avoiding clear felling. And management focuses on developing individual stems. So these principles are about adaptation, the whole ecosystem being valued, soils, water, biodiversity, maintaining permanent forest conditions. And in order to do this, you focus the harvesting on single trees. So continuous cover is known under different names: irregular silviculture, uneven age forestry, single tree forestry, as I've just said. Close to nature forestry is the European way of describing continuous cover. And in America and Canada, they say crop tree harvesting or partial cutting. These are all definitions of similar sorts of approaches to management. We also, or you may have heard of the term low impact silvicultural systems. This is something that NRW use. Generally, it does include elements of continuous cover, but it's much wider than that. Continuous cover also is in a whole range of different states. You can be managing stands that are at equilibrium, and this means stands which are already in the state of continuous cover. So a forest may be managed using continuous cover principles, but it's still not demonstrating all the characteristics of CCF. It is continuous cover because it's being managed according to that particular way of management, but it's still on a journey towards the state of equilibrium. Equilibrium is the state where you have a perfectly balanced system. There are very few forests or stands in the UK that are at the point of equilibrium. So the majority of stands managed by continuous cover forestry principles are in this transition. It's known as transformation. They're in the transition from being even age stands to irregular stands. Most stands are in that state or at different stages of transformation. Now this stand is at equilibrium. It's a broadleaf stand. It's highly productive, and it's in Picardy in northern France. It produces a very high proportion of high quality timber. The structure is surprising in that there are very few big trees that are visible. This is because it's broadleaves in the first place, because broadleaves need more light than conifers. And big trees are hidden in this dense understory. It's a very complex understory. So I just use this there. This here is the next harvest tree. But when that tree goes, these trees here, and there's another one here, will grow into a similar size, and they will be harvested at that size. These smaller trees here are left to grow on. And there's a whole lot of regeneration and poles and all these different things that are actually producing this here. But the entire harvest is coming out of trees of that size and that quality. So I'm going to describe throughout the presentation how this happens. Now this stand is in the UK, this is in England. It isn't at equilibrium. You can see straight away that there are many more stems in the picture. This is a private forest. It's Stourhead Western. It's very close to the famous landscape gardens at Stourhead. It is a mixed conifer stand with Douglas fir, Sitka spruce, western hemlock and larch, and it also has a small amount of broadleaves there as well. There are more large trees in this stand than in the previous one because they're conifers. But because the stand is overstocked and still on the journey to transformation. There is regeneration here, but not in the same sort of quantities that you saw in the previous stand. And also there are gaps in the succession from regeneration to poles to small to medium trees. So there's an awful lot here that still has to happen before this stand is at equilibrium. But it is nonetheless demonstrating the characteristics of irregular forestry. This here is closer to home. This is at Nantios near Aberystwyth. This wood is in transformation as well, and it's yielding a high proportion of soil material every time there's an intervention, but there's very little regeneration that's developed here. I click on the pointer. There's a little bit of regeneration here and different things, but the bramble is dominating this site and the regeneration is not yet established. So this is another stage of transformation. This is farm woodland. You can see what a windy place it is. That is a hedge and it's growing. The wind is coming in this direction. If I had an arrow, I would put it going that way. There's a lot of wind in this place, and yet we've thinned right up to the edge of the wood. And this is very typical of the transition from an even-aged stand to an irregular stand. You have to thin right up to the edge in order to let the wind come into the forest and let the forest filter the wind rather than to produce a hard edge, which then creates a vacuum and sucks the trees down. So this is just demonstrating one of the techniques. And again, this is a wood that's in transformation at a far earlier stage than the ones I've just shown you previously. Pause restoration. I'm going to talk a little bit now about pause woodlands. Pause woodlands are plantations on ancient woodland sites. They're areas of semi-natural or ancient woodland that have been planted with exotic species, and these are generally conifers. So they're not, but they're now made up of exotic species. And the important thing is that in a lot of pause woodlands, they retain features of the original woodland. And this is either in a greater or lesser extent because of the state of the pause. So restoration is the return to native woodland conditions, and continuous cover is a mechanism. It's simply a tool. It's a way of managing that restoration. Instead of doing it in one go, you do it in a gradual way. So the principles of continuous cover are used in pause restoration. Here are a couple of posters, two posters that I produced for a Woodland Trust conference on resilience. And I won't go into the detail now because there's an awful lot to read out there, but you'll be able to look at these things because this is being recorded and you'll have an opportunity to look at things in more detail. But the one on the left is transformation to continuous cover in an upland plantation. You'll see some of these pictures further on in the presentation, and we'll be able to go into them in more detail. But this shows you the different stages of transformation and the different benefits that you get. You know, you get timber production and you get a lot of native vegetation underneath it as well. Whereas the one on the right is to do with the pause restoration project using continuous cover. And so there were different techniques that were employed there. You know, the one on the left is commercial, the one on the right is more of a restoration project. This is an example of pause restoration. This woodland here, you can see there are some hotspots here. You can see these broadleaf trees in this area here, more broadleaves there. These are valuable from the point of view of pause restoration, but there are some conifers here as well. And there's quite a mix of different species in these woods, and it was to do with the planting design that these hotspots have survived so well. Two things: the planting design, because the planting was not with shade-bearing trees underneath the broadleaves were not compromised by the patches of plantation in between. This is because this was in a parkland landscape, and these trees were planted as clumps, and they matured. And then when the plantation was established in the 1960s, these were planted as groups in between, not underneath the broadleaves. And the fact that this has been thinned as well means that there's a process of control here, which is a continuous cover, which is allowing the broadleaf hotspots, in this case pause restoration, to continue or to survive. Let's click off, there we are. Again, another example of the same woodland here. And these broadleaf trees are not producing any regeneration because these patches of broadleaves are overstocked. They need to be thinned. And so there are various issues there about thinning the conifers, but also thinning the broadleaves as well. If you want sustainability, if you want to have a continuous cover woodland and you want to ensure that there is regeneration of all different species, conifer, commercial, and broadleaves, which are potentially more valuable, but a longer term investment. This is very, very different woodland type altogether. This is incwm, a very aggressive conifer planting in the 1950s, where a lot of the broadleaves were coppiced and cut back, and the western hemlock planted all about it. And so the hotspots are very different in nature here. Here, the western hemlock was planted underneath the native broadleaves and has grown up. Because this is such a steep-sided valley, a lot of the plantation is uneconomic. And again, this is a restoration project, and therefore there's been this process of ring barking, and this has been able to free up the broadleaves. The same woodland, and there are far fewer conifers in this slide here, and you can see that this hotspot here is virtually completely restored, and this is actually going back to native broadleaf woodland. This provides a bit of context. Here we are in incwm. You can see the railway line in the distance, and you can see here again that the broadleaves have survived because the conifers here have died, and you can see the amount of light that has come in, because initially these only had crowns up at the top, but these have actually developed all these epicormic shoots on the side. And you know, there's a mixture here of fallen deadwood, standing deadwood, so there's all sorts of biodiversity benefits in this technique as well. Right, some of the benefits of continuous cover forestry. It provides continuity of forest cover. It maintains constant production. It's multifunctional. It's both economic and it's both environmental. And it does this by maintaining constant environmental conditions. So it's good for water and it's good for soils in that respect. It's economically very efficient. It provides a regular return on a biological asset. And it provides a buffer against risks, climate and economic change. It's also adaptive and resilient, two qualities that are going to become more and more important in the face of climate change. It maintains wildlife habitat, water quality, soil productivity, special sites, and other things as well. So irregular stand structures are the key feature of continuous cover forestry. Irregularity provides continuity and efficiency. And these features are timber production. There's constant timber production through this system. Natural regeneration is one of the features. You have stem selection. Stem selection means that you have stem improvement and higher timber qualities. There's a thinning process that goes on all the way through the transformation process and during the state of equilibrium as well. So there is, every time you go into a continuous cover stand, you are improving it while you're producing timber. There's a balance between the exotic and the native species. In a forest restoration project, for example, you will have a whole mixture of commercial interests, removing the conifers, but also environmental interests, restoring native broadleaf woodland. It's the same thing in a commercial plantation. Because natural regeneration takes place, you will have you will have a whole range of different species establishing themselves, and you can actually manage the tension in between the exotic and the native. A mechanism for better risk management, I've touched on that earlier on, and also for adaptation. Continuous cover is a very useful tool if you want to manage risk and if you want to have a forest that's going to be adaptive and more resilient. You safeguard habitats and you have field layers in the forest. So all different stages are being catered for within irregular structures. So what is an irregular structure? You can have an irregular species mixture, or an irregular tree size, an irregular structure. And species is obvious. In the case of species, if you have species diversity or species complexity, you have simply different species that are able to grow on the same bit of ground. And this is something that you can think about if you're establishing new woodland and you want to actually initiate some kind of irregularity right at the very, very beginning. It comes with certain risks and certain things that you need to be aware of, but that is the most obvious type of irregularity, species irregularity. Irregular tree sizes, you get irregular tree sizes in even-aged woodlands because some group trees have had more opportunity and they take up more space than others and they suppress them. So you have natural thinning, and that means irregular tree sizes. But with an irregular system, you manage those different sizes. You have different classes of tree and you manage the different proportions. But irregular structure, the first obvious one is the horizontal one. The horizontal one is what you have with the irregular species, is that you have different groups or different matrix of different species, or you can have areas which are stocked or unstocked, and these can be holes, gaps, and groups, either of species or of standing trees. The irregular vertical structure then comes about where you have an uneven canopy. You have the holes and the gaps in the horizontal structure, which then produce regeneration, produce an understory, either shrubs or poles, and a field layer as well. So the horizontal structure are the holes or the mosaic that you find on the ground, whereas the irregular one is from the canopy to the field layer. How and when do you initiate this irregular structure? As I've said, you can do it at the planting stage, new woodland creation, and that's the species mixture, and it can either be an intimate or grouped or by compartment. So The two things here that I would say it's intimate or grouped, those are the ones that provide you with the sort of irregularity that you need. Then you go to the thinning stage. These are woods that have already been established for some length of time. When the woods are 15, 18, 20 years old, that is the age where you would start thinning. You can also thin if the wood hasn't been managed. You can thin later as well, but the longer you leave it, the more the risk in initiating the thinning. But existing woodlands are easier to transform than new woodlands, because new woodlands you have 20 years to wait before you actually start working the trees. And the existing woodlands are managed by the transition to irregular structures is by getting the right thinning patterns and then having the right selection criteria when you select the trees. And also you can do this by enrichment planting as well. So how to get started? Existing woodlands, the graduated density thinning pattern is something that I'm going to describe in more detail further along. But graduated density is initiating irregularity right from the very, very beginning of the thinning process. And you improve the quality at every intervention. Because graduated density is a selective thinning pattern, you always remove the poorest quality trees, whether they're big or small. The biggest trees that are of poor quality are the first ones to come out. This has commercial benefits as well, because you have a larger tree size. Restructuring the production cycle of the woodland is also what happens, because you start thinning, you start producing early on in the life of the stand, and you continue doing this on and on and on until you end up selectively felling and managing stands that are at equilibrium. The alternative system is to plant trees and then to wait 50, 60 or 70 years and to cut them down. And there is nothing that happens in between those two unless you do a bit of thinning in the early stages. But continuous cover is a completely different production cycle where you have forest capital, which is producing a regular income or a regular amount of production every 5 years. New woodlands, we've said this before, you plant a diverse mix of species. You choose site-adapted species because you're going to have a whole load of different microsites within a piece of land that you're planting, and you want to have the right species in the right place. And you've combined fast-growing commercial species with quality timber species as well. So species mixtures are very important. Species mixtures optimize site production. You get an interaction in between species, and you have some species which are adapted to more extreme sites than others. Excuse me. And so that the design is all very, very important. And new woodlands diversify the sources of income. By planting these different species, you will be able to have on-farm use, you will be able to have niche marketing. There are all sorts of different opportunities that come about through planting diverse mixtures. This is an example of a new woodland being established. You can see that, you know, the old hedgerows here, the overgrown beech hedgerows, and the different types of, you know, of land here, and we're in the just below the uplands. And this here has been dolloped. You can see this was a very rushy site. This is a wet gley. It's a gley soil, and this is being planted with a mix of about, there are 8 different species here, and there's about 50% citrus spruce in the mix. This is showing the dolloping in closer up. This is done with an excavator. These dollops are turned over. The dollop centers are 2 meters apart, and you can see that about 50% of the site has been turned over. All this grass here is stopping any erosion, it's stopping any siltation or anything taking place. But you have a turf that's turned upside down. It does a number of things. What it does, it It breaks up the compaction of the soil. It creates a layer of compost underneath and bottom there so that the roots to get into to release nutrients. And it provides, only for 1 year, a space where there is no weed competition and the trees can get established. This is the same place, but a year later you can see the weeds have grown up. These trees are away. It's just a more dramatic picture. Now, we need to follow pathways to continuous cover forestry transformation. Transformation, as I said earlier on, is virtually all the woods that we have in Britain. There are no forests that are truly at equilibrium. And equilibrium is always a movable feast anyway. So we have to go through a thinning phase where we have quality improvement, graduated density thinning pattern, I will look at in more detail, and you have racks along the rows and selection on the sides. You have graduated density at T1, thinning 1, that's the very first thinning, at the second thinning as well. And then after the second thinning, because there is 5 years between each thinning, you then come to T3. Well, T3 is morphing into something else because you are taking out all the poor quality material in these two thinnings here, and because the trees are responding so rapidly to the increased amount of light, all the trees that you're taking out are larger. So very quickly you come to this selective felling phase, so that it's no longer a thinning, but it's a felling because of the tree size. And you're taking trees out that have reached the optimal harvesting size, and regeneration is beginning to come in as well because the canopy has been opened up by T1 and T2. Then you come to a slightly different stage as well. It's called a target diameter felling. It's still a selective felling, but selective felling implies thinning. It implies that you're removing trees that are of poorer quality, whereas target diameter is where you are felling a tree which may be absolutely perfect in terms of straightness, in terms of knot size and all these different characteristics, but it's reached a size which if you keep it any longer, it will go down in value because the market only wants trees up to a certain size. And that's when it becomes a target diameter tree. That means it has reached a point when it needs to be felled. And while you're doing all these different things, T1, T2, selective felling and target, you are reducing the basal area. Basal area is the amount of tree that you have on each hectare. And that basal area needs to be reduced so that you let light in, so that you allow this structural development to take place. And the structural development is when regeneration, maybe enrichment planting as well, is coming in. And you are simply taking away the stand increment from the stand at each intervention. You're taking away only the amount of timber that has grown since the last intervention. And this structural development is also the progression of the regeneration into poles and then into trees that go up into the canopy. This is an example of just one of these things taking place. If you see this stump here, this is a fresh stump. It's a very big stump. So this has reached its target and this tree has been felled. And there is regeneration all about here. This regeneration is beginning to go up. And the other interesting thing is that all these trees here look to be a very similar size. This is because all the bigger trees have been taken out because they were at their target diameter, and which means that the average tree size is very uniform just after this felling. But if you look here, there are some places where the stand is open over there. There are some places here where the stand is very dense. And in these places here, the remaining trees are going to develop into this size very quickly, but here much more slowly. So the next harvest, the next target diameter trees will be these ones here around this group. And these ones here will be much slower. And so what you will do is that those trees there will grow into this size much more slowly, and they will be able to be harvested in 10, 15, 20, 30 years' time. And by that time, this regeneration would have grown into the trees to replace them. Again, the same sort of situation with the, and here you can see that this is a very, very productive stand. It's producing an awful lot of Sitka spruce, and yet there is vaccinium, there's a bilberry, and there's heather under this wood as well, so that you have the best of both worlds. You have production, and you also have ecosystem services as well. Here's the graduated density. This is the model of the graduated density thinning that I was talking about. This here is the classic system. It is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 rows. 6 rows because generally plantations are planted in rows, even at restocking. So you need to identify rows, and the classic system is 1 rack in 6, whereas the common system is 1 in 8. So you have 1 row here, which is removed. So all the trees are removed, 100% of the trees are removed. And then there are 1, 2, 3 racks on either side of the row. This row is traveled by a machine. It's a harvester followed by a forwarder. The rows on either side are kept standing, and they're thinned, so the poorer quality trees are removed from that. And then you have 1, 2, 3 on the other side as well, because there's a rack here and a rack here. So it's 1 in 8 rows that are removed. This middle one here is not touched. This is called the stabilizer. This tree here provides stability to the stand. There's always a risk in thinning. Every thinning carries a risk. And therefore, this system here does 2 things. It provides a little bit of risk management. It actually stabilizes the stand, and this has been shown to be true. And the other thing as well is it provides a certain amount of structural irregularity. This is contriving structural irregularity. I'm just going to click over to the next slide. This is the first thinning. This is the rack where 100% of the trees are removed. And then you have 1, 2, 3 rows. You can't see them because of it's difficult in the picture, but you can see here 1, 2, 3 rows there. And then there's a stabilizer on the other side. And you can see that the tree height is very low here. It's a first thinning. So these trees are maybe 12 meters tall. And you know, about 50% or 2/3 of the stem has been suppressed, but the crowns are still very deep. So going back to here, this is this stage here, T1, 100% removal and thinning on either side and on that side as well. The second thinning, this here is the stabilizer. So you come in, T1, you take that one out, T2, you take this one here out. So here it is here. You have 1, 2, 3 on either side, and that is the old rack. And that rack has closed over because in 5 years, this completely closes over. This here is T2. You can see that the trees, the canopy is much, much higher here, and that these trees here have been suppressed. No, sorry, these branches, these whorls of branches have been suppressed. And here you can see 1, 2, 3, and then the row is there. That is the old row. It's not very clear because it's cleared over. If you look through the trees here, you can see that is the old row there. So that was the first row that was taken out. That was 1 in 8, and now it becomes 1 in 4 because you take the middle one out. Now this has very, very useful benefits, that you have a canopy height here, which is different from the canopy height here. And so, sorry, the crown height. the crown heights are different, and so you're actually initiating irregularity in the stand. And here we've got a T3, and in T3 we go back on that same row, and so that we abandon one of the rows in between. This was T1 here, this is T2 and T3. And you can see that there's a lot less brash here, that the brash mat is less dense because there are fewer trees that are being selected. And here we are still taking out poorer quality trees, but you can see that all the poor quality trees have been taken out. And these figures here give you an indication of how much you take out from the sides. The main thing is that you use selection criteria so that you always take out the poorest quality trees, and randomness comes in groups, and you find that poor quality trees come in groups, and this leaves holes, and you have this irregular spacing that's beginning to develop. So why should farmers think of continuous cover forestry? Well, farmers are generally small-scale woodland owners. They have diversified multiple incomes, they're independent, they're used to collaborative working, and they need to manage risk to adapt to change. And the benefits for farmers are that continuous cover provides early income from forest products. You minimize operational costs, you increase in capital value of the woodland, you harvest at the optimum production stage, and it provides opportunities for own working. It protects the environment and maintains carbon sequestration conditions. And it works because you have a higher percent of big trees that come out. You have T1 and T2, where you're taking out whole racks of trees. You end up by doing a 1 in 4 operation in 2 operations, but at both operations, you're taking out a row of trees. And that means that the average tree size at a critical time, when it's difficult to make commercial sense of first and second thinnings, you have a higher average tree size. You also have a higher average tree size because you're selecting the poor quality trees. You're not trying to get an even spacing in between your thinning. You're actually encouraging groups. And that means taking out wolf trees, which tend to be bigger and which you can increase the average tree size. The larger the average tree size, you reduce your harvesting costs and you have access to higher value markets. So you have less low value small roundwood, you have cheaper restocking and tending because you have natural regeneration, and there's volume increment on big trees. Some people call it a forest supermarket. If you have a mix of different species, you have some trees which are going to be valuable at some period because the market has created a demand, you can concentrate your production on that species. And then if something else comes into demand, next time you go in, you can focus on that. There was a very famous forester, Longleat Estate, who used to call his forest the forest supermarket because merchants would want high quality Douglas fir, and he would go through and say, well, I'll give you this one, and how much will you give me? There's better risk management. You're less vulnerable to market fluctuations because you have a buffer. You do not have to fell at a critical time. You can be much more flexible in how you manage the production from the woodland, and it's more economic for a number of different reasons. So transformation is what we've been talking about. And as I've said, all stands in Wales and in Britain are in transformation to CCF. All continuous cover forestry managed stands in Wales are in transformation. And you have differences in the lowlands and the uplands. You have to use different strategies, different techniques. There is more weed competition in the lowlands than there is in the uplands, and therefore you have to manage the basal area and how the light comes into the forest in different ways. And you have to be more critical about how you do things. you may have higher yields and you may have better quality timber, so you may have better returns, but you may have to use some of that money to actually manage situations such as weeds and things like that that can stall the transformation process in the lowlands. In the uplands, the risks are different. The risks are to do with wind blow, the risks are to do with not being able to attain larger tree sizes or quality material, and also the risk, reaching equilibrium may be compromised because of the wind conditions in higher elevations. But continuous cover depends on, it functions because of repeated cycles of harvesting. You harvest every 5 years, you have continuous income from that. And the process starts by thinning, I've shown you that, followed by the selective felling. And there's also, the system is close to single tree selection. We have an index of transformation. This is something that you can look at later on, but you start at the product, you can identify stage 1, which is starting the process, and stage 4 is the structural achievement. This here is the preparatory phase, and this is a model. There's a study being done in Aberystwyth University at the moment, and these are some of the models that are being produced. This is a model of the regeneration phase. You can see there's a lot more space there, so the light can come in to these places here, and regeneration can become initiated. Structural development is when you have a much wider range of different size classes developing, and you have an open mosaic. And this is structural achievement, where you can see that a new color has appeared here. The green is the large, these are the medium-sized trees, these are the small trees, and these are in the right proportion for the system to function. And these blue ones here are poles that are beginning to appear, and those poles can grow into small trees, which will go into medium-sized trees, which will grow into large trees. Now, the early stages of transformation are very, very simple. They require you to follow certain principles. This whole business of selection is the key thing. You always take out the poorest quality tree. You do not leave a poor quality tree behind to put on growth. You take it out and you let the other trees take on the ground. But when you have been practicing continuous cover for a while, you need to do a forest inventory. You need to monitor the structure of the stand. This is a good example of an early stage of transformation. And these things here are features. You know, this tree blew down, but regeneration is coming up behind it. And trees that blow down can be picked up because this wood here is very, very productive. There's an awful lot of regeneration here, different sizes, and timber, which is about to be collected. Excuse me, yes, I lost contact there. I hope we're still going on. This here is a picture of a forest track, and you see this gives access to the stand. This here shows you from an aerial photograph. This here is the forest road. You can have timber lorries coming along here. This green one here is a track, as you saw in the previous photograph. You can see here the rows, and these are the racks that go along the rows. So the harvester and the forwarder go in here. The forwarder picks up the timber, takes it out on the track, and leaves it here for the timber lorries to take it away. So this track, so these here have got fresh brash mats. These racks are protected by the brash from the harvested trees. This here needs to be stoned in order to ensure that the environment isn't damaged and that they can bring the timber out here for the lorries to take it away. This stand here has just produced these logs. So you have permanent forest and production all at the same time. Same again, this forest here has been thinned, every 5 years, and it's been thinned 5 times. And you've got bilberry and heather growing underneath a productive forest. Here you have a western red cedar and a patch of western red cedar here. Because this is a pure Sitka spruce stand, we've wanted to diversify the species mixture because we feel that we can add value. A western red cedar will be more valuable. We've added western red cedar and Douglas fir to this stand. Oak and birch are coming in naturally. The target diameter concept, I've mentioned this earlier on, but there's more information there. This is an interesting comparison in between forest structure and value in clear fell versus CCF systems. This is an even-aged monoculture, which will be clear felled at some point. This here is an irregular forest, which produces on a continuous basis. And you have 2 different groups. This here is the diameter, the size distribution. So these here are these trees. You've got a few small ones, but the majority, the average is very, very, very similar. So all the trees are being felled between this size and that size on this red line, which is the price. The bigger the tree, the higher the price. The smaller the tree, the lower the price. The same red line is here, but this here, there are many small trees and few big trees. There's a big volume of big trees, but there's very small in number. And this is the production. You are only harvesting the big trees. So you are only harvesting at the high price. And this is the fundamental difference in between the 2 systems. 7 commercial reasons why CCF is an attractive proposition. Brings forward cash flow, delivers a stable cash yield, it avoids the cost of replanting, it produces larger, more valuable trees, management and harvesting costs are controlled, and it grows and maintains the capital value. It reduces biophysical risks. So every forest is different, and every forest owner has different objectives. But there have been some studies done by Forest Research which show that very similar performance, economic performances between the 2 systems. However, we're doing more and more research now, and we're actually being able to make better comparisons in between the 2 systems. And we are showing that CCF is in fact the most productive system. These are just some examples of CCF. Highly productive forest, and it looks beautiful. You enjoy going into the forest. Again, this is allowing dead wood to grow. The dead wood to remain within the forest while the forest is growing. Okay, so yeah, there is a very big picture here, and it takes a bit of time explaining it, integrating commercial, economic, and environmental benefits. But it's very easy to start using the simple thinning pattern, and it becomes obvious when money comes in and when you enjoy being in the forest again and are helping the soil and the water on the farm. Nosta.
Okay, thank you very much, Phil. A very interesting presentation. Yeah, thanks for sharing your insights and your knowledge on the topic with us. The floor is now open to questions, so if you have any questions, please insert them on the bottom of your screen by clicking on the Q&A icon and just typing in the questions. We've had a few come in. So the first question, you just mentioned natural regeneration.
Yes.
So is relying on natural regen reliable if there are deer in the area?
Yeah, that's a very, very good question. In a lot of parts of Wales, there are very few deer, but this is changing very rapidly. The deer are here, so the deer need to be managed. It's always difficult to manage deer because they don't stay in one forest, they go over the whole landscape, so you need to have a joined up approach to controlling them. So they need to be controlled. And there are some parts of Wales where it is very, very difficult because there are too many deer coming over from England in some places. Natural regeneration, natural regeneration can also be supplemented with nursery stock as well. I mentioned that there's sometimes that you want to change the species. If you want to change the species and you don't have the seed source in the stand, you have to bring in some enrichment planting. This can be done in very, very small quantities because you need the right light conditions for it to stand, and you can just put in 100 or 200 plants per hectare at the right moment, and that will supplement the other regeneration that is coming as well. But I agree that the deer are definitely a problem, and if you have a lot of deer in your area, it makes it very, very difficult, and an awful lot of continental foresters have this problem because they have no control over the hunting in their forests.
Okay, thank you. The next question: what is the minimum woodland size in hectares to make continuous cover work?
Well, that's quite a difficult question, because if you go to one of the countries in Europe where they have the best tradition, well, one of the best traditions of continuous cover, and that is Switzerland, they will say that there is no limit, that they have very small woodlands, half a hectare, 1 hectare in size, where they practice continuous cover. But they've been doing it for a very, very long time. In the transformation, you're not going to get the same economic benefits straight away that you would do in a completely developed forest. And so the smaller the size, the more difficult it is, because you have to bring in machinery, and big machinery requires hauling in, and there are costs associated with that you can't recover, that you would recover over a much bigger property. So that is definitely a problem. So there is a need to explore collaborative working, maybe to have groups that share that share equipment, or that do all their thinning at the same time. That is one option. But the other thing as well is that in the early stages, you can do a lot of this work by hand. You can do the thinning. If the wood is very small, you can do the thinning by hand. It can be thinning by waste, but it can also be pulled out and used as firewood and these different things. And the bigger the trees become, the more efficient it is to take out that timber. And if you have a very small woodland, maybe you will be looking for a grant for getting some small machinery instead of having the big machines. You would do it with or even do it with a horse. There are all these different opportunities to do that. You mustn't think that because the wood is small, it can't be done. There are examples of ways of having to do it, but you may have to think differently. A lot of the examples that I was showing you was for a big commercial woodland, and that doesn't always translate exactly the same way into a small one, but the small one will work as well.
Okay, thanks. You mentioned the cost implications there. What are the costs of single tree felling compared to coup or clear felling?
Well, right at the very end, I mentioned that there were studies being done comparing the economics of the two systems. There are no economic studies on very small woodlands. The clear fell and replant is generally on very large commercial woodlands, and that's being compared with continuous cover in a whole range of different size or types of woodlands. But the thing is that if you are going to be felling bigger trees, the harvesting costs are going to be less than if you are felling average trees that are smaller. So the bigger the average tree, the less the harvesting costs. And we can be doing selective felling for the same harvesting rate for clear felling. So that makes a massive difference. If you have those similar rates, and you are comparing one woodland type with another, and you're not comparing it with a very difficult thinning or very difficult wood to work. If you are comparing similar types of woodland, that we are showing that if you average over the whole of the transformation period, the average tree size, that you get better harvesting rates than you do when you're clear felling.
Okay.
Because the critical thing is the average tree size. The average tree size is bigger, and that reduces the harvesting costs. Now, the other that is for this the felling element, but continuous cover also gives you regeneration, which you're not paying for.
Yeah. Would extracting larger trees be more, would cause more damage to regen, do you reckon?
No. I showed you a lot of pictures where you saw big logs, massive logs in the wood that had been felled, massive piles of logs at the roadside, and behind that, in the background, you could see natural regeneration. It hadn't been flattened. Now, if you start the thinning process, you have 2,500 trees per hectare. That's a massive number of trees. You don't have any speed. Every tree is touching the other tree. So you take one tree out, and there's no regeneration because it's completely dark anyway. It's the first thinning. But you know, you are dragging the tree over a lot of the ground. But if you are concentrating the production on one big tree here and there, you're not damaging. You know, you may damage some of the regeneration, but you're only damaging a tiny proportion of it. So I think the most important thing to say in this answer is that you have to be very disciplined. And this is why I talked about the infrastructure. You have to have the roads, the tracks, and then the racks that the machine goes up and down. The machine must never leave the rack. Now, that seems obvious if you're doing thinning 1 and thinning 2. But when you have an irregular stand that's already developed, you're in thinning 3 or thinning 4 or thinning 5, sometimes the harvesting operator or the forward operator is tempted to go to the side. And that will damage the regeneration. And you must never do that. You have to stick to the rack. So if it's properly designed and you have all this space because you've created these groups, you have masses and masses of regeneration, far more than you need. It doesn't matter if you lose a little bit of regeneration when you fell those big trees. It's very efficient.
Okay, thanks. I'm quite conscious of the time, so I think we've got time for a couple more questions.
Okay.
Regarding, the drought that we've just had now, how would you manage fire risks? And would CCF be more resilient to fire risk, I reckon, during periods of droughts like we've just had now?
Yeah, there are different arguments. You know, the worst cases of fire in woodlands are new planting and restock. And you know, if you have an irregular structure, you're retaining more of the humidity, the humidity, more of the moisture is being held back in the stand. But you know, you get extreme events. You know, you get extreme droughts. Every forest will be more at risk then. But continuous cover, because it's maintaining uniform conditions, it's not releasing vast amounts of minerals or things when you know, as you do in a clear fell. It's the same thing. It's retaining more of the moisture, more of the humidity, more of the nutrients in the soil. So it's a difficult question to answer, but it is the fire risk will be less than if you have and you know, the types of fire that we have in Wales are always in young plantations or in restock. They tend not to be in more mature forests, and so continuous cover is permanently mature, and therefore it will reduce the risk. I don't want to, I'm sounding a little vague here because climate is changing and we've just had this amazing drought this year. And that creates a new kind of risk. That creates a fire risk that we're not used to having in Wales.
Yeah, you mentioned the carbon and the climate change elements of things there. Regarding establishments, ground disturbance releases carbon, and that could create a negative carbon calculation. How beneficial is ground prepping against the opinion of marking and spraying planted areas?
Right. Yes. Yeah. Well, if you're submitting your new woodland to the Woodland Carbon Code, the ground preparation will count against that calculation because it's a complicated calculation, and you will lose out on some of the carbon credits by doing the ground preparation in that way. But it's not the worst kind. You can do, if you choose to do ploughing, you will have a much worse score against you. So that the turning over, the dolloping is not so bad. And as I showed in one of the slides, you are managing the sedimentation and the runoff in that. I personally see the establishment phase is as it's something that we need to do because we don't have enough woodland in Wales. It's something that we're going to have to plant woodlands, but continuous cover, you only start thinking about continuous cover 20 years later when you come to do your first thinning. And so there's that 20-year gap where you need to wait. So, and it's a one-off event in that woodland creation process.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. I think we've got time for 2 more questions.
Yeah.
One of the attendees planted all mixed broadleaves 15 years ago through a grant scheme, and have since lost ash to ash dieback. What would you recommend that they replaced the lost ash with?
Yeah, I know we're losing more and more of our species. We're losing ash, that we larch, and oak is under threat as well. It's interesting because 15 years old, it depends on how the planting, what sort of a mixture it was, whether it was an intimate mixture, whether it was a group mixture, whether it was in different compartments. I would go for a mix of birch, oak, and if there's any wet ground there, put some alder in as well.
Yeah, thanks. I hope that's answered your question. And one last question. What are your views on grazing Shropshire sheep, or just any breed of sheep in tree plantations?
Well, that's not continuous cover because the sheep will act like the deer. And if you want to have natural regeneration, or if you want to have a whole variety of different tree sizes with regeneration or enrichment planting, the sheep will be a problem.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. So thank you very much, everyone. Some really good questions there.